In nearly every major category for the past several decades, Texas has always been ranked as only being America's second largest state. When counting by amount of land, Texas has always remained second, sitting in Alaska's gigantic shadow ever since they were admitted as a state back in 1959. There's even a common joke in Alaska that Alaska could be divided in half, and then Texas would get to only be the third largest American state. Then, when counting by amount of people, Texas has also long sat in the shadow of California. The most recent US-wide census in 2020 revealed that at that time, California had around 10 million more people than Texas. And correspondingly, when counting the states by the size of their economies, Texas has once again long sat in second place to California's larger first. But while the gap in size of land between Texas and Alaska can never be filled, the gap in size of people and economy between Texas and California has recently been narrowing rapidly. Because for the past 20+ years, Texas has been growing much more quickly than California has been, and it's been a long time coming. For decades now, Texas has been steadily making its way climbing up the ranks of America's most populous states. Way back in 1960, Texas was only ranked 6th out of America's 50 states by population, behind Ohio, Illinois, Pennsylvania, California, and New York. You see, from the time of the third ever American census taken in 1810 to a century and a half later in 1960, New York constantly remained as America's longest-lasting, most populous, and most influential state. But the pace of American settlers moving to the west and the south to states like California, Texas, and Florida were rapidly picking up pace by the mid-20th century. By the time when the 1970 US Census rolled around, a startling realization was made. For the first time since the 1810 census taken 160 years previously, another state had finally surpassed New York to become America's newest, most populous state: California. It was the very beginning of California's demographic dominance over all the other American states. And for the half a century ever since then, California has continually remained in the top position. By 1990, roughly 12% of all Americans were Californians, a proportion that has remained more or less constant ever since. But California hasn't been the only state experiencing rapid growth over the past half a century. Texas, too, continued adding more and more people and was climbing through the ranks as well, steadily surpassing Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania until finally came the 2000 census, which revealed that Texas had suddenly become the second state since 1810 to surpass the population of New York. For the past 23 years ever since then, it has continually been California and Texas in the number 1 and 2 position for the most populous states. But Texas has been spending these past 23 years growing at a much faster rate than California's been. Back in 2000, when Texas was confirmed by the census as having America's second largest state population for the first time, the state was home to around 20.85 million people, while California had around 33.9 million, around 13 million more than the Lone Star State. But over the next 20 years, California would only add around 5.6 million additional people to its population, to hit its 2020 census-designated population of around 39.5 million. Conversely, Texas added in an additional 8.25 million people over those same 20 years in order to reach its 2020 census-designated population of around 29.1 million. That means that within the first 20 years of the 21st century, the gap in population between the two states had narrowed from 13 million to just 10.4 million. And then it began narrowing even faster after 2020. You see, year after year for California's entire history since being admitted as a state, it knew nothing other than growth and more people calling it home with every passing year. But beginning in 2020, after the COVID-19 pandemic struck the state along with the rest of the world, the previously unthinkable began to happen. For the first time ever, California began to actually lose people. In the 2-year timeframe between April of 2020, right after the pandemic gripped the country, to July of 2022, the California state population declined by an estimated 500,000 people. This was due to a variety of factors, as around 700,000 previous California residents left the state over those 2 years, either by moving somewhere else or dying, while only around 200,000 new residents moved into the state to take their places. This exodus of people from California in the early 2020s was indicative of the fact that for the first time in its more than 170-year state history, California further lost an amount of its enormous political power by losing one of its seats in the population-based US House of Representatives, getting downgraded from 53 representatives to only 52, further meaning one less Californian vote in the Electoral College for president. But the situation in Texas since the COVID-19 pandemic began could not be any more different. Over that same 2-year period between April of 2020 and July of 2022, the Texan state population increased by 884,000 people, more than the entire population of San Francisco proper. Relative to California's loss of around 500,000 people, the Texan state population narrowed its gap with California in only 2 years, in nearly the same amount it took an entire decade to accomplish beforehand. As of now, in 2023, California's population is estimated to be sitting at around 39 million people even, while Texas is projected to be sitting at around 31.2 million. A total difference now of fewer than 8 million people. And if the current trends continue on as they have been, then Texas may end up even eclipsing California's population as America's newest most populous state by sometime in the 2040s. The growth in Texas's population has also resulted in an accompanying growth in the state's political power. Conversely to California, Texas gained not only 1, but 2 additional seats in the population-based House of Representatives, from 36 up to 38, roughly 15% of the number of electoral votes required now to win the American presidency. And perhaps most remarkably, the population explosion in Texas has been very well spread out across the state as well. It seems like pretty much everywhere in Texas has been booming recently. Dallas-Fort Worth, or DFW, a large urban metropolitan area in the north of Texas, has added nearly 1.5 million people to its population just since 2010. With around 7.8 million people now calling it home, DFW is the 4th largest metropolitan area in the entire United States, with more people than the entirety of Washington state. And perhaps even more remarkably, DFW is likely all set to surpass Greater Chicago as America's 3rd largest metropolitan area within only a decade from now, sometime in the mid-2030s, at which point it will only remain behind Los Angeles and New York City. But DFW is far from the only urban area of Texas that has been booming with people recently. Millions more have moved to the state's other major cities in Houston, San Antonio, and Austin, in an emerging, densely populated mega-region that is being called the Texas Triangle. The Triangle only takes up less than a quarter of Texas's total land area and is roughly comparable in size to the state of Georgia. And yet, it already contains a population of more than 22 million people, or about 3 out of every 4 Texans. It contains America's 4th, 7th, 9th, 11th, and 13th largest cities, and is the 4th most heavily populated mega-region in the United States behind Southern California, the Northeast megalopolis, and the Great Lakes. But by sometime in the 2030s, the Texas Triangle's population is projected to equalize with Southern California's. And unlike those other 2 largest regions in the Northeast and the Great Lakes, the Texas Triangle is mostly all contained within just a single state's borders. Now, there are ultimately many factors for why so many people have been moving to Texas and the Texas Triangle specifically, but one of the largest has been the rapidly expanding Texas economy, the huge number of jobs it has created, and the relatively affordable cost of living and doing business in the state. You see, between 2010 and 2021, the population of Texas grew by 18%, but the economy of Texas grew by a whopping 39% over that same time period, a rate that was approximately 1.5 times faster than the US national average rate of economic growth over the same time. Now, as of 2023, the Texas state gross domestic product, or GDP, stands at a towering $2.35 trillion, meaning that if Texas were an independent country, it would be the world's 8th largest economy when measured by nominal GDP, ahead of heavy hitters like Italy and Canada. For now, though, the Texan economy still sits beneath California's gigantic economy of $3.6 trillion. But if Texas can continue growing its population base at a faster clip than California, as it has been for the past 23 years now, for how much longer will California remain the top US state economy? There's already plenty of signs that it might not be very long at all. Texas already dramatically leads the 50 US states in terms of exports. In 2022, Texas exported a whopping $486 billion worth of products, about a quarter of all of America's exports combined, and an amount that was higher than all of the exports of California and New York put together. And part of the reason why droves of people have been relocating to Texas recently has been because of the droves of companies relocating to the state before them. In just the few short years since the COVID-19 pandemic began in early 2020, about 140 major companies have relocated their headquarters to Texas, and more than 40% of those companies relocated from California. Some of the biggest companies that did so since 2020 that got the biggest headlines included Oracle and Tesla, which relocated from California to Austin, Charles Schwab, which relocated from California to DFW, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, which relocated from California to Houston, Caterpillar that relocated from Illinois to DFW, and McLaren North America, which also left New York for DFW. And besides for all these corporate headquarters relocating to Texas since 2020, other major companies have begun to significantly increase their office presences in the Lone Star State as well. Apple's new $1 billion campus in Austin will become the company's second largest corporate office space in the world when completed, with more than 5,000 employees, remaining only behind their primary headquarters in Apple Park in Cupertino, California. Google and Meta each likewise significantly increased their office spaces in downtown Austin as well, with thousands of new employees apiece in shiny new office towers, before the tech slowdown caught up to them in late 2022. Well, Goldman Sachs, the second largest investment bank in the world, announced that they would be constructing their new second largest office space in the world in downtown Dallas, that will house 5,000 of their own employees when completed, which will make Dallas the company's second largest center of operations after their primary HQ in New York. In part because of all these wide-scale corporate relocations and expansions to Texas, the Lone Star State has been responsible for an absolutely astonishing 35% of all the new jobs created in America since the COVID-19 pandemic began in February of 2020. And to both corporations and people, Texas offers a lot of attractions. For one, the Texas Triangle sits at roughly the center point of the contiguous 48 United States, enabling easy and rapid air travel to both American coasts and to Latin America. Since 2021, DFW Airport has ranked as the second busiest airport in the entire world by passenger traffic, with 193 direct domestic destinations and 67 direct international destinations as far away as Sydney, Dubai, and Doha. It is also the primary hub for American Airlines, the largest airline in the world when measured by fleet size and passengers carried. And then, DFW Airport isn't even the only major airport in town. There's also Dallas Love Field nearby, with another 71 direct flight destinations, and it's the primary hub for Southwest Airlines, the largest low-cost carrier in the world and the largest carrier of domestic passengers in America. And then even further, there's the Perot Field Fort Worth Alliance Airport, which is primarily focused on cargo operations and is one of America's largest, acting as a regional hub for FedEx Express and a focus city for Amazon Air. All of these advantages to cheap, easy, and fast air travel to pretty much anywhere else in the country or even the world makes DFW a highly strategic center for businesses with national or global business interests to relocate their operations to. But it's far from Texas's only advantage at attracting companies and people. The state is only one of a few that has a 0% state income tax and 0% capital gains tax, while land for corporations and housing for people are each significantly less expensive than on either of the American coasts. As of March 2023, and according to Realtor.com, the median listing price for a home in San Diego was $925,000, $1.1 million in Los Angeles, $1.25 million in San Jose, and $1.3 million in San Francisco. Conversely, in the Texas Triangle region, the same data from the same source and the same time shows a median listing price for a home in Houston is just $340,000, in Fort Worth is $350,000, in Dallas is $430,000, and in Austin as $619,000. Meaning that home prices in Houston and Fort Worth are generally around 4 times less than in San Francisco. While even in Austin, Texas's most expensive city, they're still nearly half the price as seen in Los Angeles. Austin in particular has seen a skyrocketing in the cost of living over the past decade, as major tech companies from California have relocated and expanded their operations there. Back in 2010, just 13 years ago, the median home price in Austin was less than a third of what it currently is today. And this was the tallest building in the city at just 683 feet tall. Now, the city is not just one, but 2 super tall skyscrapers under construction that will tower at 1,022 feet and 1,035 feet high respectively once completed. They will become the new tallest towers in the state. And the taller of them, the Wilson Tower, will become the tallest all-residential building anywhere in North America outside of Manhattan. You see, the various different major cities in Texas all have various different economic strengths today. Tech is concentrated around Austin, finance is centered around Dallas, energy is based around Houston, while aerospace, agriculture, and other industries are well spread out all across the state. In total, there are now 54 of America's Fortune 500 companies that are headquartered in Texas, more than in California or indeed in any other state. And while there are many factors that led Texas to this leading business position that I've already discussed, the most important of all, and the biggest reason for Texas's increasing position as America's most important state, are their enormous oil and gas resources, their energy industry, and their recent technological innovations. Because if there's anything that Texas has long been synonymous with, it is the oil industry, an industry that since the 2010s has become perhaps America's most geopolitically valuable domestic asset. The oil industry in Texas dates back to the turn of the 20th century in 1901. Back then, the whole state's population was barely more than 3 million people. It was completely rural without any major cities to speak of, and the largest industries were simply timber and agriculture. But in 1901, a discovery was made in the town of Beaumont in East Texas that would change the destiny of Texas and of America forever. The largest oil field ever discovered in the world up to that point. Though its size has long since been eclipsed by many future discoveries, the discovery at Beaumont set off an oil frenzy across the whole of southeast Texas. But it soon became apparent that that wasn't even the only location in the state that had a lot of oil. Additional huge oil finds were suddenly being made in the south of the state, in the north of the state, and then in the 1920s came the biggest find of them all in the west of the state, in an area that would later become known as the Permian Basin. Within less than half a century of the initial huge discovery of oil in the state in 1901 to the end of World War II, Texas had emerged as the dominant producer of oil in America, and America had emerged as by far the world's largest producer of oil. And with that came immense geopolitical power and influence. During World War II, the United States provided nearly 6 out of every 7 barrels of oil that the Allies collectively used fighting against the Axis powers, and Texas provided the lion's share of them. In only 30 years, between 1900 and 1930, the populations of more than 5 towns in Texas exploded by more than 500% and became the fastest growing cities in America during the entire early 20th century, as millions came to strike their fortunes. In only 30 years from the initial big discovery of oil in Beaumont, the whole state population roughly doubled, and by the end of World War II, Texas had transformed from a predominantly rural state into a heavily industrialized one with many of America's largest cities. And for all intents and purposes, Texas was essentially a contained petrostate within the United States, because the oil industry effectively became the whole economy. But shortly after the Second World War, Texas and America's dominant position in the global oil industry steadily began diminishing. As the post-war economy boomed and more Americans began moving out away from cities and into heavily car-dependent suburbs, the demand for oil in the country shortly began to outpace America's own production. In 1946, the first large-scale shipment of oil from the Middle East, specifically from Kuwait, arrived on America's shores to help meet the growing demand. By 1948, the country had tipped into being a net importer of oil for the very first time, and America's dependence on outside sources of oil would only continue growing ever greater for decades and decades. The 1970s showed everyone in the United States how geopolitically vulnerable this new situation made the country. By 1970, American oil production had peaked, and by 1972, an overwhelming 83% of American oil imports were coming from the oil-rich countries of the Middle East. Then, due to American support for Israel against the combined armies of Egypt and Syria during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to embargo the United States and other Western allies of all of their supplies. The price for gasoline in America subsequently skyrocketed more than 4-fold, as long lines at gas stations became the norm for everyone. America's home economy, largely based around fossil fuels as an energy source, was vulnerable to being attacked by outside powers who controlled most of the world's supply. And so, as America's own domestic oil production kept decreasing, but demand kept increasing, America's foreign policy was being forced into becoming increasingly concerned on geopolitical events taking place far away from home in the Middle East and the oil-rich Persian Gulf, where more than half of the world's known reserves of oil were located. By the end of 1973, President Richard Nixon vowed that America's primary goal moving forward would be to achieve complete energy independence from the rest of the world within a decade, so that a situation like the Arab oil embargo could never threaten the United States economy ever again. It would end up taking well over 40 years to actually more or less do so. And in the meantime, things weren't looking very good, because by 1974, the gigantic Permian Basin in Texas had reached its peak production and was providing nearly 1/4 of America's entire supply of oil. But from then on, production in even the Permian began steadily declining as the conventionally easy-to-access oil in large pools beneath the surface began running out. Then the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran transformed that country from one of America's greatest allies to one of its greatest enemies, and therefore removed access to Iranian oil reserves from America's economy, further constraining America's supply. But somewhat paradoxically, Texas momentarily benefited tremendously from the rise in global oil prices across the 1970s, as production in the state was still pretty high and oil was the state's primary industry. The skylines of Dallas and Houston boomed dramatically during this time period, but then in the 1980s, the price of oil finally fell out and collapsed. And with its fairly undiversified economy at the time, Texas fell into a deep oil-induced recession alongside it that spread throughout the whole state's economy. Ambitious buildings that were planned to be constructed during the 80s in cities like Dallas and Houston had to be abruptly canceled, as the oil money began running out. Like this very ambitious Art Deco-inspired 100-story tower that was planned for Dallas in the 80s, but was never even started. By 2005, it had been more than 30 years since Richard Nixon claimed America would be fully energy independent within a decade. But 30 years on, America was importing more oil from abroad than it ever had before in its entire history. 60% of America's oil consumption was coming from imported sources from abroad, though by this point only 20% of those imports were still coming from the Middle East. But nonetheless, nearly everyone back then believed that America's oil imports would only continue growing even higher. By 2007, oil production within the Permian in Texas had hit its all-time low, and nearly everybody believed that the United States was doomed to be the world's largest importer of oil and natural gas indefinitely, with a chronic overdependence on foreign suppliers who could potentially weaponize their energy resources to harm the country, like during the Arab oil embargo. But then, as if out of nowhere, a technological revolution in the oil and gas industry beginning in Texas started to quickly change everything, just like it had originally done a century previously back in 1901. Petroleum engineers and geologists working in the Barnett Shale region of North Texas were the first who managed to put together two previously unrelated technologies to produce a revolutionary and unconventional new result. They had combined horizontal well drilling with hydraulic fracturing, and in doing so, came up with a new, if slightly misleadingly labeled technique called fracking. Fracking ultimately enabled energy companies to do what was previously believed to be impossible: economically harvest petroleum resources like crude oil and natural gas out of non-porous sedimentary shale rock deposited hundreds of millions of years ago beneath the surface of oceans. And as it so turned out, Texas was once covered by an ocean many hundreds of millions of years ago. And so the state consequently had a massive amount of petroleum-rich shale rock deposits beneath its surface, ripe for the new fracking technique to exploit. From the Barnett Shale region in North Texas, tens of thousands of unconventional fracking wells began suddenly getting drilled all across other newly discovered shale plays, like the Eagle Ford Sedimentary Basin running through South and southeastern Texas. And then, all eyes began once again turning back towards the gigantic Permian Basin over in West Texas. In 2012, the first successful horizontal shale well was drilled in the Permian, and the fracking boom had come to what had once been America's greatest oil field. And as it turned out, the Permian too was absolutely covered with previously inaccessible petroleum-rich shale rocks beneath the surface. As a result, in a period of just 7 years from 2007, when the Permian hit its lowest point of production, to 2014, Permian oil production more than doubled from 850,000 barrels a day to more than 2 million. And it was once again accounting for a full quarter of America's entire production of oil. As it turned out, fracking revealed that Texas contains several of the largest oil and gas fields that have ever been discovered anywhere in the world. The Spraberry and Wolfcamp field in the Permian is generally now regarded as the second largest oil field on the planet, behind only Saudi Arabia's largest oil field at Ghavar. The Eagle Ford is now regarded as the world's fifth largest oil field, ahead of the Samotlor field in Siberia, the largest of all of Russia's oil fields. And even better, the massive Texan shale oil and gas fields are all perhaps the most strategically well located of all the major petroleum reserves on the planet. These aren't the massive oil and gas fields of Saudi Arabia, that are all located in the very sparsely populated deserts of the east of the country and hemmed in by the major maritime choke points of the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Suez Canal, with major geopolitical threats immediately nearby, making Saudi oil and gas challenging to build infrastructure around that is required to get it out to world markets. These likewise aren't the massive oil and gas fields of Russia, all of which are located deep within the interior of sparsely populated Siberia, that is similarly difficult to build infrastructure to and from that is required to get them out to the world market. Instead, the massive Texan shale oil and gas fields, among the largest anywhere in the world, can be found almost precisely where many of America's largest cities and most advanced infrastructure had already been built. Overlap the map of Texan shale oil and gas fields with Texan population density, and remember the 22 million people that live within the Texas Triangle. The Barnett Shale region largely runs over Dallas-Fort Worth. The Eagle Ford spans right through the center of the triangle and runs right nearby to San Antonio, Austin, and Houston. And the mighty Permian Basin is only a bit further to the west of the triangle and is well connected to it by highway and rail that can take the basin's oil and gas directly to the Texan coast for easy, immediate, geopolitical risk-free access to the Gulf of Mexico and the world's oceans from there. Assuming, of course, that Cuba isn't under the control of a major hostile foreign power, which has, from time to time, been the case before, but not currently. Within just 5 years, from 2009 to 2014, the fracking revolution, along with Texas's geology and the location of its mighty shale reserves nearby to major infrastructure links, and the ocean, all resulted in Texan oil production more than tripling, and within time, it would accelerate even faster. By today in 2023, the fracking revolution has enabled Texas alone to become the producer of 43% of America's entire nationwide production of oil, and 25% of America's production of natural gas. Far higher amounts than any other single state has been capable of achieving. Texas now produces even more oil than Iraq. And if it were an independent country, it would be the world's fourth largest producer, barely behind the rest of the United States and then Russia and Saudi Arabia. Texas further produces more natural gas now than either China or Qatar. And were it to be its own country, it would possess the fourth highest production of natural gas on the planet, just barely behind Iran. And then even further, Texas controls the largest amount of crude oil refineries out of any US state as well, and thus possesses the largest ability out of any of the states to refine crude oil into finished products like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. As of 2021, there are a total of 31 petroleum refineries in Texas, largely concentrated around the Gulf Coast, that collectively account for about a third of America's entire crude oil refining capacity. And that grants Texas the ability to refine more oil than India and every other country in the world besides for Russia, China, and the rest of the United States. As a result, the second Texas oil boom that began in the early 2010s has proven to be nearly as massive a development for the state as the first oil boom was in the early 20th century, and has been a further primary factor in the state's recent extraordinary growth rate. And even better this time around, when the price of oil inevitably comes down again in the future, the state's economy is well diversified enough to weather through the storm, unlike in the past. The Texan shale boom, along with smaller but still significant shale booms in other states like North Dakota, has ended up completely crushing everybody's predictions back from the 2000s about the United States being doomed to become the world's largest importer of oil and gas. Quite to the contrary, Texan oil and gas production heavily contributed to the United States finally regaining the title of the world's largest oil producer from Saudi Arabia in 2018, a title that America had lost more than 40 years previously, and a title it still would not have without Texas or fracking. By 2015, Texas and the United States were already doing what had previously been thought of as impossible. That December, a tanker in Corpus Christi loaded up with crude oil drilled from the shale in the Eagle Ford and set sail for France, representing the first major export of US oil abroad since the 1970s. The United States had suddenly returned back to the world stage again as the largest oil and gas power in the world, and the reverberations shook across the globe. As the United States slowed down its imports of oil and gas from abroad, America's trade deficit was also rapidly declining. By 2019, the United States had dramatically slashed down on its net oil imports from the peak of 60% of total supply back in 2005 to less than 3% of total supply. And then, as the United States became by far the world's largest producer of natural gas, of which Texas produces a quarter of, the country gained the ability to use this abundant natural gas to produce some of the cheapest electricity and cheapest chemicals seen anywhere in the developed world. America's seemingly bottomless supply of natural gas established by fracking after the 2010s and its reliable electricity grid compared to its peers has become another primary factor in encouraging manufacturing to relocate back to the United States. And specifically, manufacturing and chemical firms have been largely relocating their operations from abroad to the Gulf Coast region around Texas and Louisiana, where the gas and electricity rates are so insanely cheap since they're right by the sources of the gas, and from where the ability to export finished products to the rest of America and to the world is so good that even some Chinese companies have relocated their manufacturing operations there, because the cheap electricity and cheap shipping costs outweigh the relatively cheaper Chinese labor. And then, of course, there are the geopolitical advantages to America once again producing the highest amount of oil and gas in the world. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, the European Union acted quickly to slash its imports of Russian oil and gas in order to deny the Kremlin funding that would help to pay for its war machine. The shale revolution in Texas and the United States helped the European Union do this in more ways than one. For starters, were it not for the shale revolution, the United States would still almost certainly be the world's largest importer of oil and gas, and would therefore be directly competing for the limited outside world supplies with Europe right now, meaning that the price Europe would have had to pay to replace Russia's oil and gas would be far higher than it really was. But because of the shale revolution, the United States was not only hardly importing any oil and gas from the Middle East or elsewhere at all, and thus was better freeing up those resources for Europe, but it was also producing enough to export to Europe itself. Since the Russian invasion, Texan and American oil and gas have been flowing in container ships across the Atlantic to Europe in a deluge that resembles the Allied supply effort during World War II. As a result, America suddenly displaced even Qatar as the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas this year in 2023, as it found itself the second largest provider of gas to the European Union at 20% of their total imports, only behind Norway in first at 31%. And the gas has of course been accompanied by Texan and American oil, as by the end of 2022, 18% of the European Union's oil imports were also all coming from across the Atlantic. The end result has dramatically blunted Vladimir Putin's ability to blackmail the European continent with energy warfare, and it's deprived the Russian army of billions of dollars in potential funding as American oil and gas coming in on ships from the West moves in to largely replace the Russian oil and gas that was coming in through pipes from the East. And the vast majority of America's ability to do all of this countering without firing a single shot has all come from the state of Texas. And then, Texas doesn't just lead the United States in oil and gas production either, but also in renewable energy. This is a map of America's regions with the highest potential to generate electricity from wind power. The windiest part of America, and indeed one of the windiest places on the entire planet, runs straight down the Great Plains from North Dakota through the Texas Panhandle, North Texas, and Central Texas. By comparison, nowhere in continental Europe does it get anywhere near as windy as it does in these areas of Texas. The only locations with similar wind potential here are within the European offshore regions of Denmark, northern Germany, the UK, and the Aegean Sea between Turkey and Greece. Consequently, Texas possesses a major ability to harvest a lot of power from wind, and it does. There are more than 150 wind farms in the state already that collectively produce over 30,000 megawatts of power and provide for around 16% of the entire state's electricity needs. That's by far the highest amount of wind power generated by any US state. And if Texas were an independent country, it would rank 5th in the entire world by wind power generation, in addition to 5th in natural gas and 4th in oil. And then to just keep adding on to Texas's energy advantages, you can further measure the state by solar energy potential, where, once again, it contains some of the best solar potential land in the entire country across the western portions of the state. And so, solar already accounts for another 4% of Texan electricity. Wind, solar, and nuclear combined provide for around a third of Texas's total electricity needs and are growing greater all the time, enabling the state to export even more of its vast oil and gas supplies to other states and other countries who need them more. Texas is therefore effectively one of the world's greatest energy super provinces, because it contains many of the largest and the most productive oil and gas fields on the planet, one of the largest refinery capabilities on the planet, some of the windiest and sunniest locations on the planet, a strategic position in the center of North America granting it the ability to easily export many of those resources across the continent, and a long coastline free of major maritime choke points to export those resources around the world from. Texas is America's greatest energy province, and the boom that the energy industry has been providing the state over the past decade and a half has reverberated across every other industry in the state, from tech to finance to aerospace and more, which has all collectively led to Texas being the fastest growing of all America's states in raw numbers of people during the 21st century. In time, by the 2040s, Texas may indeed finally end up even surpassing California and become America's newest, most populous, and most influential state. Time will tell, and we'll see if I'm right 20 years from now. Now, as a nearly lifelong resident of Texas myself, I'm prepared to admit that I may be a little biased towards my home state in more ways than one, especially when it comes to the state's food scene. Tex-Mex and barbecue have both pretty much always been my favorite genre of food ever since I was little, and today's sponsor HelloFresh offers up plenty of choices in both, with recipes ranging from these Tex-Mex enchilada bowls to these cheesy Tex-Mex stuffed peppers, to bacon jalapeno mac and cheese, and so much more. Taking yourself to a grocery store and painstakingly searching for everything you need or want and then driving back home takes up a lot of time and effort. But HelloFresh greatly innovates on that inefficient model by shipping precisely what you want in the exact quantity you need directly to your front door. You just use their app or website to select one of their 40 different meal options each week, and then all of their ingredients show up directly on your doorstep in an insulated, ice-packed box, and you can even add on extra snacks, sides, and desserts as well. Once you get your box, you can go straight to cooking with all the instructions provided on each meal's recipe card. And the cooking goes quicker than you'd expect since you don't have to deal with measuring it all and certain ingredients already come pre-prepared. That way, you can make a delicious, home-cooked meal in only around 30 minutes, without spending any of your time shopping or meal planning. It's also cheaper than grocery shopping and 25% cheaper than takeout options. Personally, it really allows me to fit more delicious cooking into my busy schedule, and that means I can avoid ordering more expensive delivery food or eating unhealthy frozen meals. That's why I've been using HelloFresh myself now for more than 2 years, and regularly order some of my all-time favorites, like these amazing Tex-Mex beef stuffed peppers. All around, HelloFresh is just a better way to eat, and it's often cheaper too, especially since you can click the button that's here on your screen right now, or by following the link down in the description below, which will take you to HelloFresh.com, where you can use the code RealLifeLore16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. It's a great way to help support Real Life Lore and eat well too, so once again, that's HelloFresh.com and code RealLifeLore16 for 16 free meals and free shipping. And as always, thank you so much for watching.